Trump basically backed off a bit on tariff talk and said that he'd rather not have tariffs. He'd rather not impose them. Now, I've been saying all along that Trump wasn't going to have all these tariffs because be paid for by Americans. They would hurt the GDP. They would either exacerbate the recession that we're going to be in, or they may tip us into it, right? They would offset the tax cuts that he's working on because they're not paid for by Mexico or Canada or China. They're paid for by Americans. And so he was talking about it like we could, get a freebie. The External Revenue Service, that was all a bunch of nonsense. And I think maybe he knows that. And that's why he doesn't want to impose them. Now, there are people that are saying, oh, well, it's just a negotiation tactic. This is like, what's he going to negotiate? Like, our problems are not because we have bad trade deals. Remember, Trump is saying we're getting ripped off by China, by Mexico and Canada. Why? We got the USMCA, the greatest trade deal ever negotiated. Do you remember when that was passed? He said that NAFTA was the worst trade deal ever. And then when he renegotiated, he said, this is the greatest. He said it was a huge monumental win. Like, he just bragged on and on and on about how fantastic this deal was. And now he's claiming we're getting ripped off. Well, how? We got this fantastic deal. How are we getting ripped off, right? I thought, this was supposedly a big win. It's all a bunch of nonsense, right? There really wasn't much of a difference anyway. I said that between the USMCA and NAFTA. The biggest difference was the name, but once Trump branded it, with his name, it was great. When it was somebody else's, it was lousy. Just like, when he was president, it was the greatest economy in the history of the world. And when Biden was president, it was the worst, even though, they were pretty much the same. I mean, yeah, maybe it was a little bit worse under Biden, but, it wasn't the night and day difference that Donald Trump claims. So this is not a negotiation tactic. It would be a better negotiation tactic if the tariffs were so great, put on the tariffs and then use reducing them as a bargaining chip, right? Put the tariffs on right now and say, okay, these are the tariffs. Now let's negotiate. That would put us in an even stronger position, I think, than just bluffing that we're going to put the tariffs on, because people call the bluff. Oh, it's just a negotiation tactic. I mean, how do you have a negotiation tactic, right? If the people you're negotiating with know you're bluffing, know that the tariffs are just, a gimmick to negotiate, then they don't give you any leverage. Just impose the tariffs. And if Trump was right, if it's a freebie, if Americans get it for nothing, if we really could put the cost of our government on the Canadians or the Mexicans or the Chinese, then why not do it? And, why stop at 20%? Why not 40%? Why not 100%? Make the world pay for everything. Just get rid of the income tax and have the Chinese pay for everything, right? Have the Europeans pay for everything, right? If that's the case, because it's not the case. It sounded great to campaign. We're going to raise taxes on foreigners who can't vote, right? But when it comes down to it, he doesn't really want to do it. And I said that. I said he would be backing away from it. And so the fact that he is, I guess that's one of the reasons that the dollar's coming down, although tariffs were never good for the dollar. It's just that the markets thought they were. Also, wanted to mention this statistic came out this week. Bankruptcies are at a 14-year high. Now, how is that consistent with all this talk of a strong economy? We have a great economy, yet bankruptcies are at a 14-year high. Does that make any sense? You would assume that if the economy was really good, fewer companies would be going bankrupt. When companies are going bankrupt, it usually means that times are tough. So most bankruptcies in 14 years contradicts that narrative, as does credit card numbers. So the percentage of people who are making their minimum payment on their credit card, and that's like you pay 2% of the balance, right? So, you owe $10,000 and you pay $200, right? The percentage of people doing that jumped to 10.5 about. That's the highest it's been in 12 years. Now, it could be higher for longer because the survey didn't start until 12 years ago. So in the 12-year history where they've been keeping track of this, this is the highest percentage of people who are making the minimum payment. Now, if the economy was strong, why would you make the minimum payment, especially with interest rates at record highs? Credit card interest rates are 24%. So if you are being charged 24% interest. I mean, that's kind of like a loan shark kind of thing, 24%, right? You'd want to pay off that credit card debt as fast as you can to avoid that 24% interest. But the fact that a record number of people are making the smallest payment possible tells you that that's the most they can afford. And they're stuck paying 24% on a huge balance because they don't have any money to pay it down. This would not be going on in a good economy. In a good economy, people would have more money and would be able to pay down the debt to avoid a 24% interest. And what do you think is going to happen next? It's going to be the defaults. Right now, people are making 2% payments. Pretty soon, they're not going to make any payment at all. I mean, first of all, what's the point? Why pay 2%? You're barely treading water. You know, when you make a 2% payment, your balance doesn't really go down. You owe $10,000 and you pay 2%. When you get your next bill, the interest is probably the $200 you paid. So you're never going to get out of that hole. You're just storing your money away, right? So you might as well just stop making the payment. So that's going to happen. You're going to see a big surge in delinquencies in credit cards. So again, all of this is consistent with what I've been saying and what the BOTAs have been saying. That is, we have a weak economy. We don't have a strong economy. And unfortunately, it is going to get weaker. Anyway, so let me get to what Trump was talking about. So one of the things he said right off the bat that I posted, he talked about the high interest rates that we have and how it's a problem. And he said that we have sky high interest rates, sky high. He actually said sky high twice. Now, interest rates have got a four handle on them, right? The Fed funds rate is in the fours. Long-term treasury debt is in the fours. How is that sky high? I mean, the president ought to know what sky high is. I mean, he's a real estate developer. I mean, he builds skyscrapers. I mean, calling 4% interest rates, right, sky high, that's like claiming a duplex is a skyscraper. I mean, we're nowhere near the sky. If you look at where interest rates averaged, let's say, since the Second World War and up to 2008 financial crisis, we're lower than normal. We've got low interest rates. They're not even close to being high, let alone sky high. But Trump wants lower interest rates. In fact, he claimed that he's going to contact Powell and he's going to tell him to lower rates, or he's going to argue or try to persuade him to cut rates because he thinks they're too high, right? He's just going to demand lower rates. You know, he said the same thing about oil prices, right? He says oil prices are too high, and he's demanding that OPEC lower oil prices. Well, first of all, how are they going to do that, right? And, you know, Trump wants America to produce more oil. Well, if OPEC tries to increase production, because that'd be the only way they can lower oil prices, would be to ramp up production. And if they do that and they drive the price down, what's that going to do to domestic production in the United States? It's going to drop because we're the higher cost producer. We may have more oil than they do, but they get it out of the ground for a much, much lower cost than we do. They're the low cost producer. And so if you want to crush the U.S. oil industry, that's how you do it. You get the Saudis to flood the market. But he wants us to drill more, but the Saudis to also pump more. That's not going to happen, right? But he's like demanding, I demand lower oil prices. And then he also wants the Fed to lower rates. But if the Saudis are investing all this money in the U.S., and he's all excited about that. Well, where are they getting that money? From selling oil. If the oil price goes down, how are they going to invest this money? They're also one of the biggest holders of our bonds. If oil prices really went down, they'd have to sell more treasuries. And, you know, one of the things that Trump is trying to demand, he wants the Europeans to buy more of our oil, our natural gas, which would be great for them because it's a lot better than buying our treasuries. But what would happen to U.S. oil prices if the Europeans started buying more of our oil? You know, he lifted the export ban. It means higher oil prices here. Right? So he's talking out of both sides of his mouth because if foreigners buy more of our oil, that's less oil available for Americans. And it's not all going to just come out of the ground. You know, we're already producing. We're already drill, baby, drill. I've mentioned the oil companies are cutting back on their capex because $78 oil ain't high enough. Remember, inflation has driven up the cost of drilling. Prices have gone up. Costs have gone up. Oil hasn't kept pace, right? Again, Trump blamed when he was on Hannity. Again, he blamed the inflation on rising oil prices. That's not why we have inflation. Inflation causes prices to rise, not the other way around. But the oil price is not the problem. It's the price of everything else. Everything but oil is what's gone way up. Oil is still cheap. And in terms of real money, in terms of gold, it's never been this cheap. Unless you want, throw out COVID, because that was an aberration when you had to pay to get rid of your oil. But in terms of real money, oil is cheap. When oil is cheap, it's got one way to go, and that's up. So people are going to be very surprised. Trump's going to get the opposite of what he wants. He wants lower oil prices. He's going to get higher oil prices. He wants lower interest rates. He's going to get higher interest rates. Now, he also mentioned the Bitcoin people got real excited because he mentioned crypto in his speech. But he didn't mention Bitcoin, mentioned crypto. It's not big, didn't sing about Bitcoin. In fact, yesterday, Trump signed a executive order to establish a working group on crypto. And that got a lot of people excited. Although the odds of Trump starting a strategic Bitcoin reserve in the first 100 days on the betting markets collapsed. They were about 50% before the announcement. They dropped down, actually, I think they went down to 12%, 13%, and then they bounced back to about 20% now. So obviously he's not going to create a strategic reserve right away because he created a committee to study